how do you go from a $70 million net worth and co-producing arguably the most popular rap song ever, always dripping in jewelry and spotted in one of his 20 luxury sports cars, to then just 2 years later, forced to file for bankruptcy with a net worth of negative $58,000?
What was the lowest of the low?
Waking up with no drugs or money or electricity in a, $10 million house.
People have their bottoms. I shot through the bottom and went all 100,000 leaps beyond the sea, bottom, really bad.
The downfall of Scott Storch is honestly the worst I have ever covered on this channel. But you are probably wondering, how does one even blow $70 million so fast? Well, as we're about to see for Scott Storch, his downfall can all be traced back to one massive mistake.
Be up for 3 days and feel like a piece of shit, feel like an animal. And I would order 4 cars, make myself feel better.
In addition to his 20-deep sport car collection at his $10 million mega mansion in Miami, Scott Storch also used to own this 125-foot private yacht, nicknamed the Tiffany. However, before we can reveal the surprising amount that Scott was forced to sell his boat for on eBay once everything crashed down, how did he even get so filthy rich in the first place? Like hiring 24-hour personal blunt rollers type of rich.
You had a 24-hour blunt roller on staff?
Yeah, that I did.
So this guy had no other job but to roll your blunts.
My monthly overhead for my household and household employees was somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million a month I was spending.
Prior to becoming one of the wealthiest musicians on the planet, the truth is, Scott Storch's life was not always so lavish. Although intrigued by these big lifestyles, and by money at a young age thanks to his father, who along with being a big gambler, also had a fascination for cars and would often bring his young son Scott with him to dealerships. However, by no means was his family super rich. A middle-class kid born on Long Island but raised in South Florida. That was until his parents got divorced in 1983, forcing Scott to move to Philadelphia.
When I was 15, just turning 15, I moved to Philly with my dad. And I was really getting into music. I was experiencing hip-hop now in my head.
Soon dropping out of high school though, and then getting kicked out of home by his dad at age 16, it was while sleeping on the floor of a garage studio in Philly when Scott's life changed forever.
I joined the Roots. They were called the Square Roots at that time. The band on Jimmy Fallon, Questlove, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't have much money, and I bought what they call a Fender Rhodes. This is big keyboard, they're very expensive now because it's a vintage. But at that time, I could get that for $200.
Now, if you aren't familiar with the Roots, in addition to being one of hip-hop's longest-lasting bands, today you might also see them on Jimmy Fallon's late-night show as his house band. Yet, you'll notice Scott Storch is nowhere to be found, because despite joining as a keyboard player for their debut album in '93, by the year of 1999, Scott made the difficult decision to split from the band. But then, in yet another insane stroke of luck, one random night at an open mic event during his first ever trip to California, Scott's life was never the same.
I ran into a girl that I knew from Philly in LA. I had lost touch with her, but it was Eve. And, she ran up to me. She was like, yo, I got a record deal with Dr. Dre. This was prior to her going with Rough Riders. And she's like, yo, you were always really cool to me. I want to take you to meet Dre. But I had no music with me whatsoever, so I didn't know what I was going to play him. All I had was, my fingers.
He sits me down, he's like, I heard you good at them keys. I start playing for him and this and that. He's real quiet and just listening. I'm like, nothing's coming from this. I'm gonna go home sad today.
Thanks to an unexpected encounter with an artist he knew from Philly, Scott Storch was able to finesse his way into a studio session with Dr. Dre. But despite initially thinking he had totally blown his chance, that was until Dre said this.
And they were like, look, here's a key for this hotel. Here's a big chunk of money. We want you to stay here. I was supposed to go back to Philly the next day.
Immediately hitting it off and agreeing to stay out in LA for a while, Scott Storch would then go on to land co-writing and production credits for 3 tracks off of Dr. Dre's album 2001. Including, most famously, playing the legendary keyboard riff for their classic hit, Still DRE.
And he was within earshot, right outside the control room was his kitchen area, and he was eating a sandwich, and I was just noodling on the piano, and I started playing bling, bling, bling on top of this drum pattern that he had, and he poked his head in, and he was like, that's it.
As one of the best humans to ever touch the keys, alongside Dr. Dre, at this point, Scott Storch was exploding in terms of both popularity as well as financial status, purchasing his first Ferrari in the year 2000. After about only 2 years of work though with Dr. Dre, Scott decided to instead pack up and move across coast to Miami, and try to build his own empire. And over the next 5 years, Scott did exactly that.
Here's volume of #1 hits. You did Beyonce Baby Boy, Fat Joe's Lean Back, 50 Cent Candy Shop. I mean, Candy Shop, right? Mario, Let Me Love You. Chris Brown, Run It. And you've worked pretty much with everybody and anybody.
You didn't even scratch the surface of some of my biggest records. Time Your River. I mean, there's so many.
Included and part of probably the hottest run we've ever seen any producer ever go on. In the early 2000s, Scott Storch would produce an incredible 5 Billboard #1 charting hits, working with superstars like Justin Timberlake, Beyonce, Nas, Eminem, Chris Brown, and 50 Cent to name a few, whose Scott Storch collab Candy Shop would spend a total of 9 weeks at #1.
Another one of my records that I really am proud of is the Candy Shop.
Scott's sound and beats were all over the radio everywhere you went, with Complex labeling him the biggest producer in hip-hop and R&B at the time. Thus, as a result, his money exploded just as big.
I had a collection. You know how some people, like, you have a collection of this or a collection of that or hobby like this? I had every single one. There was nothing I didn't have. Like,
with a new Billboard-topping hit that felt like every other week, the money was obviously pouring in for Scott Storch. However, as his bank account continued to grow, as we see it quite often with people, so did his ego and lifestyle, marking the start of his insane downfall. By the year of 2006, Scott Storch was literally worth an estimated $70 million, commanding a minimum of $100,000 per beat plus co-writer royalties, all while pumping out over 80 tracks a year. Again, Scott was raking in way more money than he knew what to do with. So what did he do with this cash? Well, of course, splurge on materialistic items, about all of which he said he purchased while under the influence of a certain substance. But in addition to his closet full of designer clothes and his multi-million-dollar jewelry collection, complete with a 34-karat pinky ring and a rare diamond formerly owned by Michael Jackson, not to mention Scott was also the owner of 20 luxury cars, including rare Ferraris and Bugattis.
And over here, we have the Mercedes McLaren SLR, and over here is Old Faithful Phantom, which I'm on my 4th one right now. This is the Aston Martin Vanquish S, probably one of my favorite cars.
He dropped a slight $20 million on a private yacht to match right up with his own private jet. He lived in a $10 million mega mansion on Miami's exclusive Palm Island. And despite living right down the road from Diddy, Scott at least claims that he never saw anything too crazy.
And we were cool, like, you know, we were like comrades, so to speak, like real, you know, cool. I was invited to all the parties and this and that, but I wasn't staying late at those parties. You know, my house was more like the Wolf of Wall Street type vibes. It wasn't like, I don't know, there was no weird shit going on, but I didn't really see any weird shit at Diddy's because it was just, to me, it seemed like everybody was having a great time and he was the provider of an amazing event that everybody wanted to get into.
But just when he thought that Scott's spending habits could not possibly get any worse, then when we consider his entire staff of employees he held on payroll, which again was at least another $1 million every month.
Like, my financial manager walked away from me back in the day, said, "You're unmanageable."
Why? Were you going crazy?
I was spending so much money.
But look, you're still here. Yay.
I had fun.
There were warning signs early on that a crash and burn was in the future, said his former manager. But as long as Storch kept making hits, he could sustain his outrageous purchases. Yet another one of these purchases included a brand new Maybach for his girlfriend at the time, Paris Hilton. As besides dating Lil' Kim in 2004 for a few months, and then even a quick run with Kim Kardashian, who was actually working as Paris Hilton's assistant back then.
Was it true? Was Kim K Paris's assistant?
Yeah, she used to sleep in my guest room. And then some weird shit happened. I'm not gonna say what happened, but and then she made it to the master bedroom.
But with each high-profile female that Scott was spotted with, though, to no surprise, always wearing some massive aviators over his eyes, these relationships and his growing clout would push Scott Storch further into not only the A-list celebrity spotlight, but also what came with it, unfortunately led to his biggest addiction. Just 5 months following the birth of his second son in 2006 with a Miami model, Scott Storch became addicted to coke, the expensive white substance that goes in your nose. And when I say addicted, I really mean it.
Let's just say cocaine is a hell of a drug. I got into bad shit, man, when I discovered the Hollywood scene and all the cameras and, you know, the socialites and famous girls that I was dating at the time, and was introduced to this pink cocaine. And it just all went bad.
Due to Scott's newfound love for the snowy powder, one of the hottest streaks we had ever seen by a producer had quickly took a turn for the absolute worst. Now, according to Billboard, Storch first found his taste for it at a party in 2006 with a friend in Los Angeles. But then by 2006, his addiction was full-blown. However, it wasn't just the drugs alone why he crashed down. For me, it was the combination of coke and women, Scott admits looking back. You feel everything so much when you're on that, and you find yourself falling in love every night. You want to screw a girl like 20 times a night, and these girls want to go skiing all night long. Then, suddenly it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you have 6 things on your schedule. But you're not going to show up to them because you're a fucking train wreck.
It's not drugs, to put it bluntly, it's and drugs together, okay? It's a hell of a combination, and drugs and all that shit, and like, you know, you get caught up in that wave, and like, it starts glamorously in your career of doing drugs, and it's just and it just turns into something real ugly. So,
and get ugly his career sure did, as despite claiming that he would be linking up with Jay-Z to work on his next album while sitting in his Lamborghini, it was Fat Joe's 2006 hit Make It Rain, produced by Scott, which would prove to be his last successful song for a very long time. And in fact, this would prove to be Scott's last song period for many years. It was a wonderful year, recalled his former manager, but I think it was defined by the month of August. He ran into the Hollywood class, and when Scott went to Hollywood, all things changed. Continuing to fall deeper by the day, in August of 2006, Scott Storch then made the decision to step away from producing altogether. A legendary beatmaker who had once become a regular atop the charts was instead now focused on completely different priorities, mainly partying with girls.
I lost the love for the music, and why I started making music was, you know, the music. It wasn't the fanfare and the glitz and the girls and the drugs. And
put it this way, if there was a certain time period for over a decade where if somebody was an A-list, I probably slept with her. I was okay, but you know what? Who isn't guilty of wanting to be with all these beautiful women?
Blind leading the blind. I'm a addict and he was a crack addict, and I'm like trying to help him. I'm like, man, you really need to get clean, man. like what the fuck is really? So I'm like, yo, you need to go to rehab.
At one point living with his close friend and late rapper DMX in his house, it was literally reported that in less than a 6-month span, Scott Storch had blown through a crazy $30 million on a Tony Montana-esque bender. And with, again, keep in mind, no new music coming out, as 2007 rolled around, things only got worse. To start, first, Scott's longtime manager and friend, Derek Jackson, made the decision to finally quit managing the producer, because, largely thanks to his new substance addiction, Scott had become unmanageable. Such as one specific night in 2007, for example, when Def Jam had booked expensive studio time for him and Janet Jackson to work on some tracks together, but to no one's surprise, instead, Scott did this.
Because I wanted to go to the Gold Rush and go get some blow and hang out with strippers. It was just like, are you fucking serious? Like, you're really gonna do that? Yeah. Like, you don't see it at the time because...
Blowing off Janet Jackson and Def Jam to instead go party, considering how fast word spreads in the music industry, Scott Storch's reputation was crumbling by the minute. However, to then make the situation 20 times worse, a year later in 2008, Scott was hit with some serious legal trouble after allegedly falling behind on his child support payments, as well as property taxes. And then, a year later in 2009, he was arrested for vehicle theft due to failing to return a Bentley that he was leasing, and in total since 2005, Scott Storch had been hit with 28 different lawsuits in both federal and county courts, as his lavish lifestyle was getting stripped away piece by piece, despite trying to hide his struggles from the public.
You want to like fake it and be like, oh, no, I still got it. And like, I'm the guy with the most obnoxious set of diamonds, right, and I'm broke as shit. Because I just wanted to look the part. My ego wouldn't let me let go of that shit.
That's a negative feedback loop.
Admitting in retrospect that his ego would not allow him to let go, after incredibly managing to blow his entire $70 million fortune in March of 2009, Scott Storch would then check himself into an intensive rehab facility in Florida, officially filing for Chapter 13 bankruptcy as well, as according to papers he filed in court, Scott's net worth had now stood at negative $58,000, and that didn't even factor in the millions of dollars he potentially owed due to lawsuits. Going absolute broke. Of course, this also meant that Scott had to start giving back everything he had purchased, beginning with losing his $10 million waterfront mansion to foreclosure, and then watching his car collection get repoed, before finally forced to pawn off his beloved yacht named Tiffany on eBay for just $600,000. Now, I say just, but remember, compared to its original price tag of $20 million, somebody got a great deal right here on a yacht. But more importantly though, it really appeared like Scott Storch was finally on the path to getting his life back together, seeking the help he long needed. However, after completing his first inpatient rehab in 2009, nobody could have ever predicted what happened next. Forced to spend sleepless nights in a spare bedroom at his friend's apartment following rehab, since basically all of his most loyal friends had abandoned him. Once rehab was finished, Scott attempted to rediscover his love for producing, returning back to the studio on a strict 3 beats a day regimen, yet this time with a different vice of choice: Every time I come into the studio, I have to make 3 hot beats, Scott told XXL. That requires a lot of mental energy and focus. And that is where the weed helps. You get fatigued and stop for a second, and then you smoke a joint, and it sets you right back where you're re-inspired.
A lot of people, like people 12-step people or whatever, they would consider that transfer of addiction and this and that. Call it whatever you want. I'm not bleeding out of my nose. I'm not unhealthy, but I like smoking weed. I built an empire on it, and it literally helped me overcome really bad addiction, so.
Compared to Scott's previous strategy of just railing lines nonstop, this was definitely a major improvement, with at one point even flying back out to LA to work with Dr. Dre again on Detox. A comeback was looking promising for Scott Storch, but that was until 2012 when Scott was arrested in Las Vegas for possession of coke. Yes, it was a mistake, he claimed of his relapse. I knew it was not the best place for me to be, adding, "There's not one part of me that wants to wake up and fucking bleed into my sink from my nose." But whether or not he was telling the truth, just a year later in 2013, Scott was robbed on the streets of Times Square by 2 gunmen at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. And with the bandits escaping with $100,000 worth of his jewelry, plus $5K in cash, once again, Scott's fortune took another big hit. In 2015, it was then reported that Scott Storch was filing for bankruptcy for a second time, stating that he was literally down to his last $100 of cash. Now, you would think that dropping from $70 million down to $100 would be about the biggest wake-up call in the world. But what happened to Scott next? After a nasty skiing habit zapped his entire fortune, Scott Storch was basically left with no other choice. And so, in 2015, Scott did this.
Only I could make myself do it. And I just remember looking in the mirror one day and I was like, you know what? I need to fucking get my life back together. And at that moment I made a crusade to do it.
Revealing that this time he had actually quit his use of the white powder for good. As a part of his new sober journey, in 2022, Scott Storch would even open his own drug rehab center in California, which, in addition to using the green plant to help patients recover, also offers music courses. "I spent 8 years addicted and was able to get sober and rebuild my life," he said. "Now it's my turn to help save lives with my healing rehab."
It was really helpful. And for me, it worked to get off of cocaine. And I'm living proof of that shit.
But while this sounded great and all, despite claiming to have rebuilt his life, was this actually true? Well, since filing for bankruptcy in 2015 for the second time, Scott Storch has been able to find his long-lost passion for producing. However, although able to land a few big songs over the past decade with new artists such as Trippie Redd, Jack Harlow, and even Ariana Grande, Scott also admits this about his return to the game. "A lot of doors were closed to me, but you've got to get in where you fit. Even knowing you were once wearing the crown, you've still got to go back in the trenches." But yet, aside from continuing to play different DJ sets around different nightclubs, and aside from still releasing a new track every couple months, such as his work with BLP Kosher, however, over the past 3 years, Scott Storch has taken a major step back, now focusing on other tasks such as being a father and telling his story on Joe Rogan, and even linking up with Neon to show off his skills.
Not to toot my own horn, but my records are timeless. Like, good music has no expiration date. You can put it on now or then, and the shit is forever. Like, my catalog just keeps going.
The one thing that no court can ever repossess is Scott Storch's legacy in hip-hop. But even though he did catastrophically plummet from $70 million down into bankruptcy twice, at 51 years old, Scott is proof that even if you lose everything, it's never over until you quit.